Hey there, it's Ed and Jess here from the TDM Growth Partners investment team. One of the frameworks we use here internally is what we call the good, better, best. And thanks to Jess, we're going to spend some time walking through one of these as it relates to medical devices. This framework has dual purposes. Often we'll share them with portfolio companies to help shape their strategic thinking, produced in industries we might want to be building our own capability and muscle on. We make investment decisions collaboratively and as a team here. And as generalists, these frameworks really help not only get people up the curve on an industry or business they might not know much about, but it really does allow for a better discussion as opportunities arise. In this case, Jess has done a deep dive on medical devices, and under this framework, as you'll see, it's really easy to get a sense of what are the key ingredients that go into not just making the good medical device businesses, but the great companies of the category globally. TDM is a high conviction, long-term growth investor, and we have about $1.5 billion under management. We're trying to compound our capital north at 25%, and we've been lucky enough to do this for the last 16 years. As you can see, we invest in both private and public companies around the world out of an evergreen pool of capital, and we're investing in 10 to 15 high-growth businesses globally with a long-term ownership mentality, and we want to hold these businesses for long periods of time. These companies are run by outstanding management teams. They've got large and growing growth opportunities ahead of them and have clear and growing competitive advantages now and into the future, and a few examples you can see in this slide of both past and current portfolio companies. While we are industry agnostic, most of our investing is in technology and more specifically software, consumer businesses and healthcare. And when we get really excited is when we find businesses that are at the epicenter of all three of these. And this is what has led to this deep dive on medical devices, because as you'll see, great medical device companies certainly traverse all three of these domains deeply. Let's take a step back though. To want to invest in and support the best growth companies in the world, businesses that we can look back on and perhaps will be defined as generational companies, it's imperative to have a framework to view and ultimately compare them by. And our framework is very simple, and we've got three very clear foundational stones that we view as the key building blocks of competitive advantage for these durable businesses. They're laid out below, and we've used Square as an example across these three, and you can read that example in your own time. But at the heart of this is what we call one mission, one platform. These businesses are created with a singular mission and build a platform with the sole purpose to execute on this. This singular domain focus and expertise that grows over time means a much better customer experience, and it is this experience that these great companies are constantly obsessed by. While these pillars are the source of competitive advantage, we do rely heavily on Hamilton Helmer's 7 powers when both identifying the type and strength of the competitive advantage that they're creating. We add an eighth, and it's perhaps the most important to us, and that's being people and culture. To create any long-term durable success, this must not only be strong, but strengthening over time. So let's dive into medical devices specifically, and here Jess really is our resident expert and drove this piece of work. So from here, I'm going to take a step back, be the layperson, maybe ask a few obvious questions along the way that might help create some clarity. And probably now's a great time to note that TDM don't own any of the companies that are mentioned right throughout this presentation. But Jess, maybe to start with, let's peel back a layer from the general frameworks that I just laid out, how, based on your research, you've identified a common platform for assessment of great medical device businesses.
Sure thing. So I think, as Eddie sort of mentioned earlier, we look at healthcare, consumer, technology, and something that we love about medical devices in particular is that we're seeing a real convergence towards effectively the epicenter or intersection of those three circles of competence. And a lot of this framework that we'll run through today kind of highlights this, but really the focus was on looking at a range of case studies within the space, those that have performed particularly well, perhaps not so well, to try and identify and understand the key contributors to success and develop, as Eddie mentioned, sort of this framework that we can then use to assess and look at medical device companies as we build out and continue to bunker down on our domain expertise in the space. So I think what we were able to identify is sort of these four key buckets And as depicted on the page in this flywheel type format, they're not necessarily discrete, separate items, and they all do kind of feed into each other and enforce each other. But it was our best attempt at kind of categorizing and pulling out these key elements. So I think, product development and technology, an obvious one. Access, so that's really, how easy is it for the patient to get their hands on this device? Education, that's both on the patient and physician, the clinical side, and also payers and regulatory bodies. So that's something to highlight within the healthcare space, is that there are a lot of people within the ecosystem you have to consider as developing these devices. And then finally, go-to-market, which is a bit stronger on sort of the marketing focus and how you communicate and get in front of your consumers.
Is it worth touching on just why you've depicted it as a flywheel?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I sort of mentioned, it's hard to pull them out as separate items, but the more you kind of develop, if you start, say, a product development and technology, the better device you have and sort of data and things you can extract from that, the better situation or evidence you have to go forward to regulators and payers to get better regulatory and reimbursement outcomes, thereby improving access for the patient. A big piece of that too is education, so leveraging that data appropriately and getting the education resources out there for all parties within the ecosystem. And then also creating and kind of shifting with that towards this model that's a bit more direct to consumer, given that patients these days are more empowered to inform themselves of their own treatment alternatives with the access to all this information out there. So how can you leverage that to have this direct one-on-one and ongoing relationship with the consumer? And once you have that then in turn can feed back into product development and technology, because you can access those patients, learn what they like, don't like about the product or the device, and use that to inform ongoing development.
So Jess, there are obviously some really key metrics and data points that each of these four buckets have, and the purpose of our What Does Great Look Like framework is to go into each of these more deeply, and we will over the course of the next 20 minutes. So we might keep moving. I'd love to get your view on the category leaders, just a quick snapshot for reference, because they will be referred back to throughout the next 20 or so minutes. So maybe just some colour around these 5 category leaders.
Yeah, for sure. So as I said, we kind of identified medical device players that we were familiar with, had been following for a while at various stages of maturity, and also various stages or degrees of success that they'd experienced. But I think the key thing underpinning our decision here really speaks to what we touched on earlier, this concept of one mission, one platform. So all these devices are sort of singular device companies that are really addressing one particular cause. So if we quickly step through them, Dexcom, so continuous glucose monitor, Dexcom are a leader in that space. So that's diabetes patients at the moment are users, but you can see down the line how everyone could effectively become one, but really a means to continuously monitor what your glucose levels are doing. Align technology, then I think most people will be somewhat familiar with. That's really the Invisalign system, so the invisible braces effectively. I think they've had incredible success, and they're really awesome one to kind of dig into and look at what they're doing, particularly in direct-to-consumer sort of engagement with patients. Then we've got iRhythm, who's been in the news a lot lately, who really speak to the challenges that these medical device companies can face with respect to regulatory and reimbursement. But what they're doing is continuous sort of cardiac monitoring, so redefining the way cardiac arrhythmias are diagnosed and reducing the burden on clinicians. It's again sort of a wearable device. Tactile Medical, leader in the development of at-home therapy devices for the treatment of lymphedema, which is just, excessive swelling effectively. So what they're doing is interesting in that they're taking away a lot of the friction for the patient by having to visit a physician frequently for massage and draining of the lymphatic systems, rather than now with this device they can sit at home and kind of do that themselves in the comfort and privacy of their own home. And then Inogen, finally, is a market leader in the development of portable oxygen concentrators. So delivering oxygen when you have oxygen deficiencies, and it means that's much easier to get around rather than carrying around sort of a mask and a big oxygen tank with you.
Let's get into this, because what in fact great does look like across these 4 buckets is fascinating. So I'll let you walk us through, in fact, what it looks like for each of them. And let's start with product development technology.
Yeah, great. So product development and technology is kind of an obvious place to start, especially given that we're looking at medical devices. So fundamentally, it's about the product and the tech within the product. But I think what we've seen recently, well, not so recently, but in more recent years, is that there's been this real evolution away from purely dumb hardware to this ecosystem of both hardware, software, and data and analytics, and creating a holistic device that really caters to the full journey of the patient. But looking at this, we kind of identified within, we touched on earlier, didn't run through them, but sort of the main metrics and categories, and kind of distilling that into key takeaways in terms of what great looks like in product development and technology. We identified these 5 sort of main areas, one being continuous innovation. So continuously innovating on what that product looks like. And here we're probably speaking more to the hardware, the form factor. And so making that more usable, more user-friendly, and leveraging sort of that stakeholder feedback to inform innovation. Great companies in the medical device space are really good at tapping into that, such that the product is consistently catering to the needs of the patient. Next, software and data and analytics. So really, again, building out that ecosystem, creating those actionable insights which benefit all the stakeholders, whether that be the patient, the physician, the payer, the medical device company themselves, and the device and data security to ensure patient privacy. This then kind of feeds in, again, to this idea of the consumerization of devices, and that speaks mostly to leveraging sort of the hardware, data, software, and analytics, but also the connectivity. So the ability to look at the results that are being reported out of your device on a mobile phone, your iPhone, your Apple Watch, just in a means that's very interactive throughout most points of your life. What this fundamentally results in then too, by focusing on all these pieces, is that high level of R&D expenditure. So you see, particularly in early stages, that R&D as a percentage of sales for these companies can be up to sort of 20% on average, for a long period of time as they continue to invest in these developments. And some of the efficiency that then comes through is in digital manufacturing, where, by focusing on better automating and catered to mass production, medical device companies can reduce gross margins and then leverage that to invest in further development.
Sure, they're all interlinked to some degree. It's not viewing these in isolation.
Yeah, so I think the best way to look at it then is sort of on this slide here where we have the Venn diagram. And the way we kind of visualize it is in this way. So you kind of have hardware, software, data and analytics, and everything else kind of plays around that. But really, the best medical device companies are operating at the center of those 3 circles and adopting the mentality of being sort of a digital technology company, operating across all those 3 things.
It's a really interesting diagram, and just looking at it, Jess, it reminds me of what the best consumer device companies have done. And many people who are listening probably have had no touch points with a medical device, so to speak, but the consumerization that you've already talked to, whether it be an Apple Watch or a Whoop that you're wearing or a continuous glucose monitor that I've got on, you can see how this framework is really attached to each of these successful companies.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point to start. So maybe touching on, given that we've got Dexcom featured in here and Eddie's wearing the continuous glucose monitor as well, I think Dexcom have done a phenomenal job of that, whereby, rather than just saying we do continuous glucose monitoring, they've been really thoughtful of the ecosystem and the products they can build out around that to create this really great customer experience. So effectively, you wear the continuous glucose monitor that they've innovated on and made into a patch with a very slight sort of piece that injects under the skin to continuously monitor your level of glucose. And maybe, Eddie, is it comfortable to wear?
Yeah, I was a little ambivalent, a non-diabetic, and I don't like needles, so it wasn't uncomfortable. There was maybe a little bit of discomfort for the first 10 or 15 seconds to put it on, but after that it's become a really useful piece of hardware that I can tap my phone on every 2 hours or after a meal to read my glucose monitoring. So it's been amazing to see the ease at which the hardware has integrated with my phone, that's integrated with, in this case, the Levels software.
And I think, if you think that's sort of awesome to hear, and effectively what Dexcom are hoping to achieve as well is Eddie, who's a non-diabetic, is even using this hardware now, versus historically you're a diabetic, you have to prick your finger every couple of hours, draw blood, test that. Just an incredibly non-user-friendly, non-patient-friendly experience. So to be able to develop a device and sort of the connectivity with your iPhone to create this experience which is kind of consistent with the patient or just broader consumer desire to track what we're doing and how our health is performing and broader sort of wellness throughout life is really a trend that these medical devices are following, such that you now have users that are not diabetics that are using products such as the Dexcom CGM, and you can see how that then unlocks a number of markets for these types of medical device companies.
It's probably worth touching on, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, the level of R&D over time, because it is a really key metric to look at.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think obviously we're getting used to seeing high R&D spend levels, having spent a lot of time in tech investing. So it's not something where I'm familiar with, but particularly I think, if we adopt the Australian lens, it's not always something that is very favourably perceived by Australian markets who are perhaps a little more risk averse. But really these devices, if you want to invest to create best-in-class leading devices, you have to really invest in R&D. And you can see historically in this chart here, Dexcom almost 45% up to, close to 50% 10 years ago or so, they were investing in R&D. That's obviously tapered over time as they've kind of achieved efficiencies and matured. But you can see that at the earliest stages of their development, these companies are spending a lot of money in R&D. And what we've got then on the next slide, which can be uncomfortable, is that this is at the sacrifice of margin or profit. But what that does is that really sets you up for growth further down the line. So it's kind of this weird negative that you operate in for a period of time, but a fast inflection and uptick on your revenue growth further down the line, given that you have that early R&D investment, you've built the muscle for that continuous innovation and continue to improve on it and gain efficiencies there, which really set you up for continued growth going forward.
I know it seems obvious, but seeing these two visually just really reminds me of software investing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that we like, is that healthcare and medical devices in particular are kind of really a confluence of all our learnings from the software and technology side and the consumer side, and we're really seeing this come through. But what's interesting is that given the complexities sort of on regulatory and the fact that you do have a number of customers effectively being sort of the payers, the physician, the patient, which does make it a bit more complex, that sort of uptick and pick up in your revenue growth on the back of early investment, comes a little later down the line.
Let's just quickly whip through this, but you identified some key medical device leaders earlier. In terms of product development and technology, a quick peer comparison that is so visual in this slide.
Yeah, so I think what really stands out, rather than going through item by item, is kind of looking at Dexcom and Align as the first two columns, and they're pretty much all green. So both of them have done really great jobs in terms of this continuous product innovation, building out that software and data analytics ecosystem, the connectivity. And you can kind of see this in, their patents. Dexcom has 566, Align 951. If you look across the rest of them, they're much lower. So they've really not only invested in R&D, but in protecting it as well, which kind of reinforces their lead there too.
So the second bucket is access. And maybe, again, I think it's worth just having that high level information as to what does great access look like.
So the access front can easily, I think, we talked about before how the buckets weren't necessarily discrete. I think access and go-to-market are the two that are probably most difficult to pull apart. But what we really try and focus on the access side of things is, how easy is it for the patient or the physician to get their hands on this product? And a lot of that really does come down to the relationships with payers, which are sort of the insurance companies, and the reimbursement strategies and sort of the teams and resources that these medical device companies build to position themselves well to have favorable reimbursement policies such that patients can afford the product, because that's some of the biggest challenges in these spaces, is that they're complex medical devices that have, as we've seen, taken a lot of R&D to invest in and develop, so they're expensive. So this reimbursement piece is really important in terms of unlocking access to patients. And then finally, sort of this bucket here is more just the broader patient journey, so a more considered patient journey. So how do these companies think about not only getting the device in the hands of their patients, but tracking the patient journey as well?
What does best in class, maybe an example of what a best in class business that has provided great access to their product look like?
One company that we've found has done this incredibly well has been Tactile Medical. So we've got sort of a bit of a slide here which summarizes their distribution infrastructure. So this is kind of more the internal resources and the way they've built up their team. But what really stands out is that they've had consistent sort of strong reimbursement engagement from payers. And this is really a function of having large team. There's over 100 people in their reimbursement strategy team. They've got relationships with over 1,000 payers. And so they've really just focused on being super knowledgeable and engaged and knowing who these payers are so that they can position themselves best to continue to gain the reimbursement levels they need such that their patients have access to the product.
This is really coming to light in the next slide. So it's probably worth just touching on this briefly.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, we talked about they've got this payer relations group, so that's kind of more the relationships with insurance, and then this reimbursement operations group. So, this is a US company. It's hard sometimes here in Australia to wrap our hands around the complexity of the US system, but we talk about wanting to take friction out of the patient experience. The US system puts a ton of friction in. And so what this in-house reimbursement group, Tactile, have kind of taken that on and said, well, we want to limit that as much as possible so that the ultimate end patient experience is as frictionless as possible. So they kind of take on and carry out a lot of the reimbursement process from initial order to final bill. So that's sort of all the paperwork, insurance verification, authorization, all those sorts of things. So they have a whole team that does that rather than laying the burden on the physician and the patient. So that kind of really drives greater adoption. Physicians are going to be more inclined to prescribe this because it's less work for them, and patients are going to be happy to adopt it because it's less work as well. And then really, that's one element. And then the relationships they have with these payers have obviously really helped them to be able to execute on that. And what we see there in the right-hand side is, you've got commercial payers and Medicare, but overall they've got an 85% plus approval rate for their patients in getting approval for funding for their product.
And this really plays into one of those foundational stones that we talked of right at the top. What do great companies across any industry look like? And that huge foundational stone of customer experience, being obsessed with how the customer experiences, touches, in this case, pays for your product and reducing that friction.
Exactly right. And I think that's hyper complex in medical devices in the healthcare space, as I mentioned, just given you've got all these, your customer is multifold. It's not just the end patient. So being really smart about that, and these great companies, that's what they do. And they really build up the resources, understand the system, have people on the ground, have the relationships. And that really is what positions them well to be able to provide access.
It's a wonderful insight. There's another case study here in regards to Dexcom, but I think people can probably read that in their own time. Again, let's just whip around a quick peer comparison across the 5 medical device leaders and how they stack up when it comes to access.
So again, I think patient access is the obvious one that we kind of touched on. And that's really, how easy is it for the patient to get a hold of the product. That might be, Dexcom, what they've been doing recently is pursuing the pharmacy channel. So previously, they went through a classic medical device channel in the US known as the DME channel, which is far more burdensome from a paperwork and regulatory sort of perspective. So by opening it up to the pharmacy channel, they're making it a lot easier for patients to get access. So that's sort of an example of best in class there. Reimbursement achievements we've kind of covered off. Dexcom again has done well in terms of positioning themselves there. Tactile we ran through before. And then another piece is really sort of when you think about access, kind of more from the physician side of things, but there are medical guidelines which define what devices or treatment options are presented to patients. So if these medical device companies can do a good job of sort of informing the ecosystem of the benefits of the product and kind of really building in and kind of pushing for it to be a first line form of treatment, then again, that's going to improve access for the patient. And fundamentally, then it all really boils down to affordability, which can be a particularly challenging one when you're dealing with expensive devices. But again, and consistent with the theme of what we've been talking through, everything kind of feeds into each other, and that's really contingent on reimbursement as well.
A massive piece of the puzzle for all these medical device companies is education. And we often associate it with biotech companies and, clinical trials. How does education fit into this framework when it comes to devices?
I think education is really important when it comes to medical devices. Well, there are clinical studies. It's a very different sort of construct and framework to pharma and biotech, but gathering real-world evidence and matching up devices, new devices, say, against existing forms of treatment and proving that it's a more effective and a better patient experience is really important to drive not only patient adoption, physician adoption, but again, sort of that regulatory and reimbursement outcomes. If you can prove that the device is, more favorable and is going to be more broadly used, then everyone's kind of more willing to engage with and access.
And this must be hard for these medical device companies.
Really hard because research is expensive. So again, this kind of ties into your R&D, but there are creative ways that some of these companies have gone about doing that. And I think it's not just the research side, it's the advisory boards, the KOLs, so the key opinion leaders. So being really thoughtful about that network of high profile people with experience in the space who can really influence it in a one-to-many fashion and kind of push the product and the education around the product out broader.
Is it worth touching on a best-in-class case study when it comes to education?
Yeah, so I think we talked about, I mentioned there were some creative ways that some of these companies were doing it, and Align is one we like to look at in terms of how they've been really thoughtful about bringing that education very early into the ultimate prescribing physician, in this case the orthodontist or the dentist, very early into their journey. So what they've done, they have, one thing they do is sort of these research award programs. So that as a first step is sort of leveraging universities and people studying to kind of bring awareness to the product, but also create a bigger volume of data around the way it's performing. And so that works from that way. But what's most interesting, I think, is what they've done in terms of creating university programs that are included as part of the education curriculum that really have basically like a module on Invisalign in orthodontic programs, so that these orthodontists are coming out to practice already trained and informed and well versed in the Align product and what it does.
So Jess, just like previous categories, let's just have a quick peer comparison whip around when it comes to education.
What first stands out to me when I look at this is the amount of red, so which just really speaks to how challenging it is to build up this body of research and evidence and provide access points and touch points for education. Again, it's becoming quite obvious that we quite like Dexcom and Align. Both of them have done quite a good job here. We've touched on how Align have inserted themselves early into sort of the physician education journey. But I think what's particularly interesting as well with Dexcom, not only have they done sort of the clinical evidence piece to prove out the product and the way it works, but the economic evidence. And that can be really important, again, from the reimbursement standpoint, because by proving that it's not only better outcomes for the patient, but a more economical outcome versus other alternatives, that's obviously a favourable data point to put in front of these payers that are covering the cost of a lot of these devices.
As often is the case, it's easy to touch on what people are doing well, but just to go straight down Inogen, what's been the friction for them to succeed in and around the education piece?
I think it's hard to say because they've got more peer-reviewed clinical studies than any other provider in their space, but it's a particularly challenging space. And you've kind of, well, this portable oxygen concentrator space. So you see ResMed Raw recently kind of dropped out and dropped that piece of their business because it was just uneconomical. And part of it is, insufficient education, getting that to payers so that they provide favorable reimbursement outcomes. And I just think they haven't sort of built out the muscle and the resources to execute on that. So they're not really getting in front of early stage physicians. They haven't been able to build those proponents for the product from the advisory board or key opinion leader standpoint. And while they have this great body of clinical evidence that's really worked well, the economic piece is perhaps lacking, and that's what's made it perhaps a bit more challenging from the reimbursement side of things.
Yeah, it's worth just reflecting that it was under affordability, under access, it was a big red circle as well. So those two are certainly interlinked.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, all ties together.
The last piece that we just want to touch on here is the go-to-market. And what do these great medical device companies, what does it look like, a great go-to-market strategy?
So I think consistent with the theme we've kind of touched on is this go-to-market really evolving in the same way as consumer businesses have done. This concept of multi-channel. And I think fundamentally it's really speaking to meeting the patient where they want to be met. So, do they want to consult a doctor and do it all through those means because that's traditional and comfortable and makes you feel sort of like you've done all the right things and ticked the right boxes? Or do you just want to go pick it up at the pharmacy, which is the route Dexcom are now taking? So I think being cognizant of sort of your patient cohorts and segments and geographies, and being mindful about where they want to get the product and kind of marketing to them in that way, and kind of building up that direct to consumer awareness is really important too. So we've seen a lot more of that. As I mentioned earlier, sort of this theme of greater patient empowerment in their treatment outcomes. You now have patients coming to doctors saying, I want a Dexcom device, and that's because they've done such an incredible job of marketing direct to the patient as sort of best-in-class product. And look, it connects to your iPhone, your Apple Watch, you can do all these things, you can barely see it, you can barely feel it, it's this great experience. So I think that's a really important piece there. Secondly, sort of strategic partnerships. So as we've kind of touched on, it's a really big ecosystem. And as these medical devices venture more into sort of the tech and connectivity space, you've got the big players like Apple, Google, all those guys are doing a lot in the space too. So to push sort of this health and wellness agenda. So being mindful of that and sort of plugging into that. Some companies have done a really great job of that, and I think that's sort of the way to go, to be an ecosystem player with your one mission, one platform focus, and kind of plug into the rest, build this more holistic approach rather than try and cover everything. And then the last two sort of things are really just being mindful of integrating your customer feedback and sort of that go-to-market feedback into product and development, which is kind of part of the circle we touched on earlier. But something that I think, and this again is something Dexcom has done really well, is this patient community piece. It's one of the case studies later on, but these Dexcom warriors. So how do you get your patients and build that sort of consumer love that you see for a lot of consumer products? How do you do that such that your patients are going out and espousing the product and encouraging, so it's effectively free marketing for you?
You could almost insert this slide, it seems, into a Lululemon presentation. Putting that consumer hat on, it's almost the exact same playbook.
Absolutely. And I think this is kind of where I in particular get most excited about medical devices, having done perhaps more in the consumer space historically, is that you are really seeing this convergence, and it's no longer an excuse that, medical, the healthcare space is antiquated and kind of behind. They have no choice now but to step up and meet the consumer expectations that they're experiencing in all industries, because that's just sort of what we expect to get today.
Yeah, there's a consumerization of medical devices as there is in enterprise SaaS.
Yep, there's a consumerization of everything, it feels.
And so Dexcom, a clear leader here, as you touched on.
There's a few examples, basically in every one of those buckets we just went through. So I kind of touched on this pharmacy channel unlock for them. That's something they've been pursuing more recently and view that as a potentially quite large channel down the line, but really again just removes a lot of that friction of the patient experience. You can see in this chart here, through the DME channel it's 3 to 4 weeks to get the product. Through the pharmacy channel it's 1 to 2 days. So people like, Eddie or non-diabetics can easily access these things now, and it's completely broadening their prospective patient base. And then, for the people who desperately have to use it every day as part of their treatment as a diabetic, they can now pop out to the pharmacy rather than having to run through this DME process every, however many years based on the warranty of the product.
Is it worth just touching on Align, who've also done this really well? When I think of Invisalign, I think of it as a D2C company, really.
They've done an unreal job. We've actually got a couple of people in the office who have been through the experience recently. So I've been creepily sneaking over and peering over their shoulder to kind of observe what they have there. And sort of that whole experience is quite brilliant in terms of, you have a platform you can log into that monitors the movement of your teeth throughout that time. And it's kind of they've been really incredible in bringing the patient in and then retaining them throughout the entire patient journey, such that the patient is consistently having this one-on-one touch point with Invisalign.
And it probably plays into that very first slide that we talked about in terms of product development. That's a great use case for data and analytics, meeting software, meeting hardware, for the consumer on a minute-by-minute basis to interact with.
Exactly, and because if you think about their product, right, it's effectively this grossly simplifies what they're doing, but a fancy mouth guard. There's only so far you can go with the hardware, and then you effectively hit a point where the innovation really has to be around that consumer engagement, the software, the data analytics, and how you engage the patient in that ongoing patient journey.
The last peer comparison whip around, what are your key takeaways here?
Again, Dexcom Align, we've touched on them. They've done an incredible job, and you can see too that the SG&A as a percentage of revenue doesn't necessarily have to be high. And I think part of this is if you pursue these direct-to-consumer strategies, there's of course going to be some investment up front, but what you get is that you have that maintained relationship with the patient. They keep coming back to you without you having to invest in bringing them back. And then one of the case studies we didn't dig into too much, but that ownership of the patient relationship, and I think something that's really allowed Dexcom to kind of have that low SG&A spend is that they've built this patient community called Dexcom Warriors. So these are users of the Dexcom continuous glucose monitor who love the product and have signed up to kind of be effective. They're all ambassadors for the product. And, Nick Jonas, sure, is one, he's a celebrity, but most of them are everyday people. And what that really does is it's, sort of free marketing for the product. And they've been able to really engender that patient love such that people are going out and doing that of their own accord.
Boil this all down for us, Jess.
So I think we went through a lot of content, and as you kind of hear as you go through, it all sort of feeds into each other. So it's can be hard to disaggregate and kind of pick and choose what pieces are fundamentally most important. So what we kind of tried to do as a synthesis after running through all this work is, if we wanted to very simply kind of run through the key factors for success for these medical device companies, I think it fundamentally boils down to, you've got, continuous product innovation is incredibly important, and informing that innovation around evolving stakeholder needs and wants and employing best-in-class technology. That is what you need to do to be a leading medical device company. But you can have the best device in the world, if you don't have effective distribution, if you don't have the regulatory relationships, the reimbursement, and the channel set up to meet the patient where they want to be met, you're going to face challenges on that front too. So if we look at maintaining a defensible position as a leading medical device company, you really have to have both that continuous product innovation and effective distribution, so you have the best product in market and the patients can get access to it pretty easily.
Awesome summary. Jess, thank you so much for your time. really insightful commentary, a great piece of work, and hopefully those watching and listening to this have found it both entertaining as well as really informative. So thanks. Hope you all enjoyed this deep dive into what makes great medical device companies. And if you enjoyed this, you might want to check out some other TDM insights. The best place to find them is on the website tdmgrowthpartners.com or across our social channels. We'll be found on Twitter at TDM_growth. We've just finished another series of scaling up and interviewed some incredible guests. You can subscribe to that on Spotify or across other podcasting channels.